you for being here. This is a public press live event. You're on camera, surveillance and protests. We're going to have a discussion about how law enforcement agencies are using surveillance technology, and in particular, how the San Francisco Police Department has gotten access to live feeds of private camera networks to monitor protesters. Our guests today are Dave Maass, Senior Investigative Researcher at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and Shelby Perkins and Craig Nelson, who are graduate students at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute. And they are doing work there researching local law enforcement agencies' surveillance capabilities. Our host today is Laura Wenus, who's the host of Civic, the daily news and public affairs radio show and podcast, sponsored by the San Francisco Public Press on KSFP 102.5 FM in San Francisco. Laura, I'm going to hand it off to you. And if anyone has questions, please direct them to Lila LaHood in the chat, and I will be feeding them to Laura. Thanks.
Thanks, Lila. I want to jump right in and continue this conversation that we've had over a couple of weeks now about surveillance and in particular law enforcement surveillance capabilities. And Shelby and Craig, I want to start with you because earlier today, the Public Press published an article that you co-wrote about the prevalence of certain types of surveillance technology that Bay Area law enforcement agencies use. You looked at 80 law enforcement groups. Some of them are governmental and some of them are part of universities or community benefit districts. Can you both talk a little bit about what some of the most common technologies in use are in the Bay Area? And let's maybe start with Shelby.
Yeah, thank you. So the most common technology we found in use at these law enforcement agencies is body-worn cameras. That was not a huge surprise to us given the push for that in recent years. And then the second highest we found was automatic license plate readers. Again, we were not surprised by that. And the most surprising ones we found were the prevalence of camera networks and camera registries, which were at 36 and 33 of the agencies that we looked at.
Craig, did you want to add anything about what you found in terms of the number of agencies that use these types of equipment?
No, nothing to add. I think that was pretty accurate, Shelby.
So both of you wrote quite a bit about camera registries and camera networks, like you just mentioned. Can you explain first the distinction between what those are?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll tackle that first part. So a camera network is something like CCTV that a law enforcement agency would use and establish throughout their area of jurisdiction. Whereas a camera registry is if you as a private citizen, either at your business or at your residence, you have a private security camera already set up. You can register that security camera with your local law enforcement agency. And according to their websites, slightly different wording on each one, but if there's a crime that happens in that area, they may contact you to see if your surveillance camera caught it and if they could use that footage.
So there's sort of a distinction here between whether cameras are in use and installed by law enforcement directly versus if they're privately owned and operated and the police can come knocking essentially and ask for the footage or access.
Yes,
exactly.
Essentially.
Yeah.
So I want to discuss one set of cameras in particular. Earlier this year, the New York Times and a few other publications wrote about a private initiative to install hundreds of cameras around the city. And this was presented as a public-private partnership that might get around privacy concerns by not being strictly a police initiative. But then Dave, you and a colleague at the EFF looked into how exactly the business improvement district that manages some of these cameras was partnering with the SFPD. What did you find?
Thank you. I was just waiting to be unmuted. So let me back up a little bit. So we started looking at this issue of these business improvement districts and community benefit districts about maybe a little more than a year ago, when there'd been some local reporting about some surveillance networks that were going up. It's going to take a second to explain the mechanisms of how this obscure form of government works.
Please do.
So in the Bay Area and in other parts of the country, there's something called the Business Improvement District or a Community Benefit District. They're basically the same thing. But essentially, the state legislature gives San Francisco the ability to create these geographical taxable areas, and they can, by proclamation, create them, and then taxes are collected from the business owners and the property owners in that area, and then that money goes into a pot, and then the city contracts with a nonprofit organization to spend that money on services. So if you're in, you know, the Tenderloin or downtown and you see new garbage cans going in, or you see people cleaning up needles, that often comes through one of these community benefit districts. Now, about a little more than a year ago, maybe about a year and a half ago, this one particular San Francisco resident, Chris Larson, who is the sort of tech billionaire behind Ripple, which is a cryptocurrency, started going to each of these little nonprofits that run these special districts and offered to donate a sophisticated camera network. And so over the last year and a half or so, we've seen well over 1,000 cameras go up in different parts of town. 6 of these special districts have installed these. And the one that we were looking at was the Union Square Business Improvement District. Union Square Business Improvement District is like the first one of these that was ever created. All of the businesses in the Union Square area pay taxes that fund this entity. And so now they have an entire camera network that is monitoring everything in that area, in Union Square, over in Maiden Lane, Market Street, that whole area. Again, it's still a little political weeds here, but last summer, the city and county of San Francisco passed an ordinance that requires all surveillance technology purchases to go through a public process. The police department has to write up policies in advance. They have to write a privacy impact assessments, and then they need to come and get a vote of approval from the Board of Supervisors before they start using anything new. But because this business improvement district is not technically part of the city, they were able to buy the cameras without going through the process. However, they are subject to public records laws, and so we filed the public records request and found that during the protests at the end of May and at the beginning of June, San Francisco Police Department sidestepped the rules and started using those cameras to monitor not just looters and assaults, but to actually gain a large amount of footage and monitor the cameras live when there was no suspicion of criminal activity. Sorry, that was like a roundabout version, but it's a complicated series of a decade's worth of laws.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the process that you went through to get this information, because you had to file a records request to figure this out to begin with. And I suspect that you were looking at this very closely because you've been keeping an eye on it for some time. But you went and you did this records request and you got some emails. Can you describe the exchange between the SFPD and the Business Improvement District?
Sure. So I'm actually like patting myself on the back for a lot of foresight here, because when we heard about these camera networks, 6-7 months ago, we filed public records requests then to find out what does the documentation look like when the police want footage? What are the blank forms? What are the logs like? So we actually knew going into the protest exactly what kind of documents they would have. And so when we put in our public records request, we got all of the forms that needed to be filled out, the log of access, but we also got some emails. And the emails were particularly interesting because it would be someone from the San Francisco Police Department emailing USBID and saying, hey, we think there might be some violence later. We think there might be some rioting. Can we have access to your cameras? They were given access for the first weekend. Then a couple days later, they were like, oh, that was so useful. It was so great. We hear there's going to be more protests this week. Can you extend it for another 5 days? And they were like, sure. And then they wrote back saying, oh, that was so great. It helped us with situational awareness and public safety, Yahoo. We did see some prosecutions come out of it down the road, but all of those prosecutions came from, requesting footage after the fact, not any of that live stuff. So really what they were doing was getting access to these cameras, remotely. So if someone at SFPD had access to it, and we're able to watch all the protests all the time. That's what situational awareness means. It means seeing everything as it's happening.
So as you pointed out, San Francisco has this law where law enforcement agencies need to run it by, I understand, the Board of Supervisors, I think, first. They need to get permission to use new surveillance technology. Now, they didn't need to get it in order for the Business Improvement District to have these cameras. But according to you, if I understand this correctly, what the SFPD did here is a violation of San Francisco privacy law because they didn't get that permission to access the cameras live. Is that right?
That is correct. So just because somebody else has the footage, the issue isn't necessarily purchasing it, although purchasing is one element. It's actually accessing it and using it. Now, if we were talking about what's called an exigent circumstances, which is, you know, an emergency, like there is a man-eating tiger running around Market Street and we need to catch it before it mauls people, that would be exigent circumstances. They can bypass the law to, like, you know, we have minutes before the next person is gored, run upstairs and then like look at the footage. That is totally allowed. What's not allowed is to be able to access it for extended periods of time without being able to articulate a particular emergency. And that's what happened here. They started using it, they installed the software in their computers, they accessed it for what looks like for more than 7 days without getting any kind of approval whatsoever. So yeah, that is what we think violated San Francisco's ordinance.
Shelby and Craig, I want to get back to you guys and ask you about how easy it is to figure out with camera registries like this, who's actually volunteering their privately owned cameras for law enforcement use in general. Can you find that out?
Shelby can speak to this better than I can, but short answer is no, it's not easy. It's easy to find out which cities use a camera registry, but details further than that, we found it was not easy to find.
So Shelby, what did you find?
We found that a lot of law enforcement agencies are pretty transparent about, hey, sign up for this so that we can access your security camera. And outside of that, we really struggled to find any details, like how are they using this footage? How close does it have to be to where this camera is for them to ask you? How long are they going to hold on to that footage? Any policies like that. Out of the 29, I believe, agencies that use it, only out of the 33 agencies that use it, only 3 have policies detailed that we could find.
Yeah, so
go ahead, Craig.
Oh, okay. So yeah, just by their nature, the cities that use camera registries are going to advertise that they use the camera registries because they need people to volunteer. So it was easy to find that on most of the police department or city websites. But then, like what Shelby was talking about, if you want to know what those police departments are authorized to do with that footage, who has access to it, for how long, what can they do with it exactly, we had a difficult time finding that in any of the policy manuals.
Yeah, so it's not just necessarily who's signing up. There's no full, let's backtrack for a second. Is there a list with these law enforcement agencies that just says we've got, you know, X number of people, or like these businesses are the ones that are allowing us access to their security cameras?
Not that we could find.
Yeah, from what we found, that kind of information, the police departments normally kept that private. And I think that's to attract more people to volunteer.
Mm-hmm. So not only do we not know who or even how many people or businesses have registered their cameras, we also don't know what happens with the footage afterward, who is accessing it, what they're looking for, what kind of access they're getting, or how long they keep this information.
Yeah, exactly. That was our concern.
So these cameras in Union Square were being used to monitor protests. The 3 of you have been on our program Civic previously to talk about surveillance in connection with protests. So I don't want to rehash too much, but could you say a bit about what other technology is used regularly by law enforcement that could capture things like who is at a protest? Maybe we'll start with Dave on this one.
Good call.
Sorry, I'm trying to mute here. Maybe I should just keep my mute off. I wanted to just back up real quickly on the last question about the who has the surveillance cameras.
Oh, sure.
So yeah, the registries, the police departments tend to keep that confidential. However, the San Francisco District Attorney's Office does have a data set of cameras that it has identified, and you can get that through a public records request. So in 2018 or early 2019, we published a map on EFF's website of all the surveillance cameras that the district attorney's office had identified. Also, if people are interested in our blog post about the surveillance of protesters, one of the records that we got was the location of all the Union Square Business Improvement District cameras. So there is just a running list of where all those cameras are. But to get to the idea of what people are, what police are using to surveil protesters, we've seen a range of technologies, particularly in the Bay Area. So obviously body-worn cameras, you see that anytime you see a police officer monitoring a protest, it is being recorded. It is going into a database somewhere. That is probably one of the most common things. But over in the East Bay, we know that that during the protests in 2017 on UC Berkeley campus against some of the conservative speakers that came to speak, during those, UC Berkeley had the Alameda County Sheriff's Office stand by with its drone team. And the drone team would just wait until something happened that could be classified as a suspected felony. And as soon as a suspected felony happened, up those drones went up in the air. We also had an incident where during one of those protests, the UC Berkeley put in a search warrant to get phone information on everybody who had attended that protest, with the idea that they would be using these phone records to identify Black Bloc members who had caused some property damage.
Sorry, I have to interject. What phone information exactly?
Oh, wouldn't you like to know? I
Yes.
certainly would like to know. It is unclear because of the redaction. So we've had to, this is a long story. We can do another podcast on this, but no, it took us a while of fighting and threatening UC Berkeley for them to finally provide a redacted copy of the search warrant. And it's very unclear what they gathered and what they didn't. We believe it's phone metadata, locational information, perhaps some sort of identifiers, but what's available to us is fairly limited. I don't think it was like text messages or emails or anything like that, but they were using it to get information from people's phones in order to identify who they were. That's all we happen to know based on the available information.
Wow. Were there other technologies on the list that you wanted to get to before I interrupted you?
So one of the things that we've heard of being used is potentially license plate readers, which are cameras that take photos of license plates and then attach a timestamp and a GPS coordinates for where that car was seen and put it into a database. So you can go in and you can type in somebody's license plate and see all the times that car was captured on camera. And we've heard anecdotally that might be being used. But if you think about some of these car protests as an alternative to physical marches where people are driving around in a caravan of cars, that's something that would be very, very easily picked up on license plate readers. And maybe not even intentionally, like just driving around, you'll get caught on these cameras, whether you like it or not.
Right. I think I know the answer, but Shelby and Craig, of the technologies that Dave just named, how many of those, which of those are in use by law enforcement agencies in the Bay Area?
Go ahead, Craig.
So out of the 80 agencies that we looked at, we found body-worn cameras in 55 of them, license plate readers in 41, camera networks in 36, camera registries in 33, and then between those two pools, there were some that used both. And so I think in general, the takeaway is, at least in the 5 counties that we examined, you would be right to just assume that a police officer you encounter is going to have a body-worn camera, that they're going to use license plate readers, and that you're going to find yourself under some kind of camera surveillance, whether it's a network or a registry.
Shelby, did you want to add to that?
No, I completely agree with everything Craig said.
So one thing I wanted to bring up also before I go there, I want to remind everybody that you can submit your own questions. If something is coming up for you that you would like any of our 3 panelists to respond to, please put that in a chat message to Lila LaHood, who's our publisher. She'll pass it on to me. I wanted to ask about facial recognition, because San Francisco has banned its law enforcement agencies from using facial recognition. But as we've learned today, law enforcement agencies are not the only ones who are using surveillance technology. Does that ban also apply to privately owned technology? Dave, I think this one's for you.
I think Dave's muted.
I think we didn't unmute for Dave.
There we go. Sorry. Every time I mute, it's like you need permission first. And I'm like,
yeah,
but I haven't. So no, it does not apply to private entities or non-County of San Francisco entities. It does apply to SFPD can't just go and borrow somebody else's face recognition. It is prohibited from doing that. But even the Union Square Business Improvement District's policies, which aren't like an ordinance, but they are policies, also ban face recognition from their system as well. So that's useful. Yeah, but they're not there's a few face recognition bans in the Bay Area, but it's not universal. And there's a lot of opportunities for other agencies to abuse it.
For those of us not steeped in the history of this discussion, why ban facial recognition? What's wrong with it? I think you might need to just stop muting yourself, Dave.
Yeah, I'm going to stop. It's just a force of habit. So face recognition is a tainted technology in a lot of different ways. It's really hard for it to have been built, face recognition technology without abusing the images of people online and the images of inmates. And that's one of the things that really bothers me just on a fundamental level on how face recognition is created. But how face recognition is used and deployed, I mean, there are errors with it. It can misidentify people. It can misidentify. It is definitely less accurate with people of color and women. It is racially biased in the sense that beyond just the errors, it is usually drawing from a mugshot database, which has been built up over years and years of biased policing. There's just like a range of just problems that are around it. I've not seen that many good arguments for it other than what the marketing companies put out there saying, oh, this is going to make it easier to identify people. This is going to make it, easier to catch the bad guys, but it really doesn't bear out in the end. But, there is just, I don't know, I could probably talk for an hour about this. What we have seen, though, is this movement nationwide to really curb it. I believe Portland, Maine just banned it like this week. We're expecting similar legislation in Portland, Oregon in the next week or so. But we had a ban in Santa Cruz take effect, Oakland, a bunch of places in Massachusetts. It really is a growing phenomenon.
I want to talk also about automated license plate readers, because it might be difficult to immediately figure out ways how this could come back to people. Like your data may be sitting around somewhere, you might be thinking, if it's collected by an automated license plate reader. But I think that there were actually some cases recently in Southern California where people who had been to a protest later had their cars impounded. Dave, is that something you can talk about?
Yeah, so license plate readers and how they're used are kind of enigmatic. In California, law enforcement officers have been told for years to try to keep use of license plate readers out of police reports to whatever extent they can. So sometimes we don't even know when it's been used. But we hear cases often, often in the immigration context, or now with the story that you're talking about, which I think came from Forward, I believe it's a Jewish news magazine, that had a report about protesters and their cars getting pulled over. But we've tended to notice that when people are getting stopped by police in mysterious ways, where the police somehow found them when nobody else should have found them, often we believe that might have been tied to a license plate reader system. Essentially, police are able to create watch lists of people based on their license plates, and there's no regulation in California. I haven't seen regulations really anywhere in the country saying how and when you can add somebody to a license plate reader watch list, and they're sharing them agency to agency across the country. We've seen cases here in San Francisco where there was a privacy advocate named Brian Hofer who was pulled over and detained by police because the license plate reader had a watch list that said his car was stolen when it was just a rental car. There was a very famous case, here where a bus driver had been just driving home in her car, and a license plate reader with a watch list misread her car as a targeted vehicle, and she was, essentially handled pretty roughly by the police, and she sued, and that went up all the way to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So I do think that of all the tools out there, that police are using license plate readers quite a lot, whether it's for looking at protests or using it to do contact tracing, simply because it's just data that's available to them. Almost, hundreds of agencies across California are using license plate readers, and if they don't have the cameras themselves, they're able to buy access to databases containing other people's license plate reader camera data.
Thanks. I wanted to give Shelby and Craig an opportunity here to talk a little bit more about what's in the piece that they've published today, because you've done a lot of work, both of you, on documenting, or at least researching and then compiling the documentation that law enforcement under a new transparency law is required to put out there for their communities. And it sounds like, while law enforcement agencies are complying, sometimes it still doesn't make it necessarily easy to figure out what technologies are in use and how they're being used. Can you both talk a little bit about your findings on that front?
Yeah, I can start. So first of all, in our project, we examined the 5 counties that we did in 2 different ways. And the first way, we used an unrestricted array of open source media, anything we could find in the news or social media, what have you. And then in the second way, we looked at what we could find just using the publications that are required by law under Senate Bill 978, which applies to all the municipal departments, police departments in California. And what we found there was most of the police departments publish their policies in a way that you would expect, in a text recognizable PDF document. So you open the document and you just word search a term like body camera, for example, and that comes up, and it encompasses the whole document, and it's easy. And you don't need any inside knowledge of that particular police department or policing in general to navigate the document. An uninitiated outsider can find that information easily. And then in a few others, really in 16 of the 67 municipal law enforcement agencies that we looked at, they did something different. They used a partitioned interface, is the term that I just kind of made up for it. But it's a bunch of different headings that you must click into. And then when you click into that heading, you get a section of that police department's policy or training. And what that requires then is you have to know your way around the filing hierarchy. You have to recognize the headings and have an idea of what you're going to get when you click on that file. And really what that amounts to is, if you don't know what you're looking for, you're going to do repetitive searches across every file that they've added. And it just makes searching much more difficult for a lay person. And we were most concerned that 3 of the largest population centers in the Bay Area use this. So that's Oakland, that's Berkeley, and it's San Francisco. So for us, it was difficult to confirm the things that we found in the unrestricted format, just using police manuals in those 3 population centers. And we just thought, why would they make it that hard?
Yeah, Shelby, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just that what people might not realize is these are, every policy manual is at least a couple hundred pages long, some of them well over 1,000 pages. And so kind of the most egregious that Craig didn't mention is some of them aren't even in PDF format where you can search. They're just images essentially. And if you wanted to look through all 700 pages, you couldn't just search body worn cameras. You couldn't search camera network or license plate reader. You have to actually go through and read all of them, which that's difficult. Even if we were doing this for a couple months and we struggled with it. So if someone was just trying to investigate their community and they don't have this background, it'd be nearly impossible for them to be able to do this in a timely manner.
Yeah, reading 600 pages doesn't seem exactly like light evening reading if you're curious how your local law enforcement agency is using those body-worn cameras or the data that they gather from them.
Exactly.
So with all this so prevalent, there's cameras, there's body-worn cameras, there's license plate readers, there's social media monitoring, which we haven't even talked about, but there is a Civic episode on that if you're interested in listening to it. This is everywhere. It's happening all the time. Are there ways that people can avoid being surveilled, either in their daily lives as a matter of principle, or if they're engaging in something like a protest? Is there any way to avoid this? Dave?
All right. It can be very, very difficult to go out in public without being captured on camera. And I think that, there are a lot of people out there who are trying to come up with sunglasses that will block face recognition or t-shirts that will foil license plate readers. And I love all of those methods, but they're not necessarily going to be effective at scale and for everybody. What we tend to So we do have some security guides on our website for attending protests, the things that you can do, such as not bringing your phone or bringing a burner phone with you. We have guides for journalists and to make sure that they're protecting themselves in case their cameras get seized. But all of those are fairly intense, and you really want to spend some time planning and going one by one through our checklist of things that you can do ahead of an event like a protest. But beyond that, there's a lot of problems. Like license plate readers, it is against the law in California to do anything to your license plate that would interfere with the license plate reader. So, I mean, like my advice is, I mean, if you can park in a garage, park in your garage, but that's not necessarily like available to most people in the Bay Area. I certainly don't have like a garage door or a garage period that I can put my car in. But I think there's some policy solutions. We have successfully gotten laws passed in San Francisco, in Oakland, in Berkeley, and some other places that do require some checks and balances on this technology. And so I think getting involved is probably the best protection that you can, best self-defense you can take in this regard. So if it comes up that San Francisco is looking at purchasing a whole fleet of drones that are going to surveil people, there's now going to be an opportunity to oppose that. Like, the police just can't just purchase it without telling anybody. They have to come to city council and make the case. And so spending those, extra few minutes to send an email or to show up and say, no, this is not right for San Francisco, that actually was probably the best way to fend off these kinds of intrusions.
I want to make sure we get to audience questions, and just a reminder that if you are listening to this and a question comes to mind, we don't have a whole lot of questions. So if you want to ask one, please shoot. Chat that to Lila LaHood, our publisher, and she will pass them on to me. There's two sort of related questions that I'm seeing here. One is, there are privacy things to be considered with cameras, but do you see any use in crime solving? And any of you can chime in on that.
Okay, I will sort of jump in. I mean, can I see it being useful in some cases? Yes. Is it actually a proportionate use sometimes? Like, do you always need to like show up with the most expensive, most powerful surveillance technology in order to combat a crime? I don't think so. I don't think so. And I think that a lot of it is a waste of money. And I think that a lot of it doesn't produce results. And a lot of the money that is spent on surveillance technology could probably be better placed in other ways to improve the community that will have the domino effect of improving public safety. But, that said, like, certainly there have been, there are definitely some success stories that police officers will point to. There is certain evidence gathering that happens after a crime has occurred that can be useful, particularly with like phone data. But a lot of the technologies that are designed to monitor people live, or that are designed to capture technology on everyone, I just don't feel like that is a balance. With license plate readers, for example, they're collecting data on everyone all of the time and storing it for years. Now, police will say, oh, well, this is super useful because if a crime occurred, I can go back and see where this person had been every day for 2 years. That is going to be useful to solving crimes. It is also a massive intrusion on civil liberties, and it is a fairly un-American position to believe that you should collect evidence on people because they one day might commit a crime, not because you believe they have already committed a crime. So, I mean, yeah, there's going to be some success stories. Yeah, there's some limited uses where it's going to be useful. Cities and communities should find a balance, but I wouldn't buy the hype.
Shelby and Craig, either of you want to weigh in on that?
I'll weigh in on it now that the most qualified person to speak about it already has. For me, I've basically given up any expectation of anonymity or privacy, and I think as technology continues to develop, it's just going to get worse. So, as far as I'm concerned, I'm overall comfortable living in this kind of with this much surveillance in place. And I've lived in other parts of the world where it's even more robust than this. And I'm sure that if those cities were here to defend themselves, they would say they do it for a reason. Yeah, that's what I'll add.
Yeah, I'll just throw in there, I'm not quite sure if this addresses the question that the person who asked it had, but there are, efforts to bring criminal charges against some of the people who were involved in smashing windows, et cetera, at Union Square, as a result of the footage that was handed over to SFPD by that business improvement district. So I'm not sure if that's what you mean by solving crime, but there have been information has been handed over to people who are looking to pursue criminal charges as a result of that footage. I think this is kind of speaking to Dave, what you were getting at, but one of our listeners has asked, what separates this from spying on American citizens?
I mean, it is. I'm a little confused. There's nothing that separates it. Nothing.
Yeah. Someone also asked. Go ahead.
I'll attend something here, Laura. I think what would separate it is if it's clearly articulated in a policy that's been approved by that community, then I think that's what sets it apart from spying.
Mm-hmm. Someone asked what I think is a technical question and perhaps about facial recognition, but maybe this has an impact regardless of whether there's facial recognition technology in use. Someone asked, how is the fact that everyone's wearing masks now affecting what's going on with surveillance?
So there have been some early studies showing that masks are messing with face recognition out there, that it's making it more difficult. That said, the companies that make face recognition are rising to the challenge. And so they are starting to work out, well, how much of the face do we actually need in order to do face recognition? Can they just do it just off the eyes and the forehead, the bridge of the nose, that kind of thing? So right now, short term, it's having issues with face recognition. Long term, I don't see that as a problem that the companies aren't going to be able to get over.
Another person wanted to know, does SFPD have an intelligence branch or similar that's coordinating this mass imagery collection data strategy? These are terms that are not super familiar to me. Craig, Shelby, does this ring a bell to either of you? Because you looked into this pretty extensively.
Yeah, sorry, I found. I think though, what I would tell you is the most information that I got on SFPD's capabilities came from San Francisco's city webpage. I think it's the Committee on Intelligence and Technology, and it's mentioned in the piece too. There's a link to it. If you click on that, that's going to show you all of the surveillance capabilities that the city employs across all of its departments, and I found that to be the most informative.
Shelby, did you want to add to that?
No, that's a great answer. I was not familiar with those terms that the question referenced.
Dave, is this ringing a bell to you? An intelligence branch? Do police departments generally have intelligence branches?
Yes, but I muted myself again. So I'm going to just move my mouse over to the other side of the room. So in the case of San Francisco, this came through the Homeland Security Unit, which might be the closest thing in San Francisco. There might be a separate intelligence analytical unit. What we tend to see in police departments is that they do have some sort of data-driven unit or a 21st century policing unit or a predictive policing unit. They use a bunch of different terms. Often it'll be like intelligence or intelligence analytics. And it's just sort of code for bringing in all of the data and searching it and running software on it and using that as an approach to tackle public safety, as opposed to, say, community policing, where you go in and you try to build up community trust and community relationships. This is kind of like the opposite of that, where you just put technology between you and the community.
I think we'll close with this last question from the audience here. Any advice or strategies for digging into or resisting business improvement district surveillance in California or the network of police cameras that are throughout my city? And I understand that's a question from somebody who lives in LA.
Oh. Well, I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to plug our project, the Atlas of Surveillance.
Go right ahead.
All right. So I first came into touch with Shelby and Craig because we had launched this Atlas of Surveillance project with the idea of collecting data from police departments all over the country about who has what technology. And Shelby and Craig, reached out and were very interested in collecting this data for the Bay Area. And that's where we ended up where we are today. But at the atlasofsurveillance.org, you're going to have the ability to search wherever in the country what kind of technologies that we have found have been there, or you can look at how one particular technology is spread across the country. LA certainly is infamous for having all kinds of surveillance, face recognition, license plate readers, drones, the whole kit and caboodle. They've got it there. I'm not so familiar with how the business improvement districts work there, and I'm not necessarily certain what kind of camera networks they have there, but I would love to see a surveillance transparency process in the Los Angeles County area. but you can file public records requests. That's always something that you can do. Getting city council members interested is always something helpful, but there's not necessarily with the business improvement districts, you don't really have that avenue. And so it's a bit difficult. You have to just sort of find somebody in the city government who is willing to advocate for you, and then maybe you get some leverage.
And Craig and Shelby,
sorry,
didn't mean to step on you. Please go ahead.
I was actually talking with someone who lives outside of California when we were originally doing this project. And once I kind of showed them the scope of our giant Excel sheet of all the technology.
Oh, I think we've lost you.
Oh.
Make an Excel sheet and essentially do it. So you can find the technologies that are being used around you. We did have SB 978, so we could look through policy manuals, but most of our information came from news articles or social media. We went through a lot of police department Facebook pages to see if they had body-worn cameras on them in the pictures. And that's how we documented it. And we linked to those photos. So if you're worried about this happening in your community and law enforcement agencies, you can just create this project on your own. And if you're finding data that maybe scares you or alarms you, you can go work with your local officials.
And if you do collect this data, please come talk to me at the Atlas of Surveillance, because we would love to include anything we're missing in our map. And there's a whole avenue for collaborating with us. And we have some tips for how to do that kind of research as well.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Dave, Shelby, Craig, thank you so much for your time and coming on to join us here for this webinar. I think I'm going to leave it at that and hand it back off to Lila to close us out.
Laura, thank you. Dave, Shelby, Craig, we really appreciate you being here with us today. Thank you to our guests for joining us. If you are interested in viewing this video again or sharing it with anyone, I put the link to our YouTube profile in the chat, and Daphne also reposted links to some other related coverage. Once again, you've been joining us for Public Press Live. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time.